Thank you. Well, I want to take this opportunity to certainly thank everyone who contributed to making it possible for me to come here. I have to say that I have heard of Miriam's work for so many years, and I wish I had been one of Miriam's PhD students myself. I really think that she's brought a lot of attention to community interpreting, and I'm here to talk about one of the initiatives that the IMIA has been working on that I believe really does help to professionalize the field. So I'm going to start off by saying a few words to give you some context. So please understand that in the United States, medical interpreting has really undergone a very big transformation in terms of professionalization. So there are some assumptions that might not be true here in Israel, but I want to make sure that we see this presentation within this context. So because of globalization, medical tourism, and human mobility, medical interpreting has really grown as a specialization of interpreting. Hospitals are relying on individuals to interpret. And while most hospitals at first rely on volunteers or any individual, as somebody just mentioned, family members, it really has started to change from ad hoc interpreters to contracted and even hospital employees that are now being trained and tested to provide medical interpreting services. Because of the languages that are mostly utilized in the healthcare system, most of the interpreters that are working in healthcare organizations have the local language as their second language. So that's a bit of a difference between conference and sign language interpreters, who are usually fluent in the local language of the country they work in, with community interpreters and especially medical interpreters. Now, the level of general education, interpreting training, and linguistic abilities varies quite a bit, and that's a reality to this day in most countries, even in the United States. Now, while there are few employment and educational opportunities for those that specialize in medical interpreting, it really is growing worldwide in many countries. And in the US, you can say that more than half of the hospitals do hire medical interpreters, whether as contractors or as staff. Another assumption I have to make here is that medical interpreting is a highly specialized field. Now, while we know that in some countries, generalists are providing medical interpreting services, the actual work of interpreting in a medical setting is quite specialized. And something that has helped a lot in professionalizing the field is that providers, doctors and nurses have really taken an interest in doing research related to medical interpreting. So contrary to other forms of interpreting, most of our research is actually done by healthcare professionals. And so that has helped educate, provided us with forms to do client education. So doctors are reading these studies and they're seeing the benefits of working with professionally trained interpreters. So having, given you some of these contexts, what the IMIA is working on for several years now is an educational program accreditation. Now, we use the term accreditation certification differently in different countries. In the United States, we talk about certifying professionals, and we talk about accrediting organizations. So what I'm talking about here is the accreditation process for educational institutions who provide medical interpreter training. And the reason we're doing this is so that, one, we can provide standards for best practices in interpreter education, and also provide training programs that are teaching medical interpreting with some sort of seal of approval. and to create for students, administrators, and educators a means for them to, know whether a training program is, teaching medical interpreting to the standards needed for them to pass certification exams. And we also want to promote in the future for medical interpreters to really receive minimal education for medical interpreting. Now, why are we doing this? Because most universities don't eagerly introduce medical interpreting programs. The private sector in many countries has started to do that. So you end up having two tiers of educational programs. You end up having a few university programs that offer medical interpreting, and you have companies, for-profit organizations that are creating training programs, very short 8-hour, 20-hour, 40-hour, 50-hour, 100-hour programs. So there's really no oversight of the quality of medical interpreting education. Because there is a need, the demand is there. So programs are taking place and people are getting trained. So we're trying to urge university programs to really consider creating and developing medical interpreting educational systems, because it's really in academia that we will professionalize the field. But in its absence, we need to have minimal standards. So these are some of the members of the accreditation task force that has been working for quite a few years. And each one has a certain level of expertise. So one of our members has an expertise in online education. It's becoming very popular in the United States and in England to have remote interpreter training. So that's an area that we need. And this is our advisory board. We have an advisory board that also represents different sectors of the educational systems that offer interpreting. And we also have members of important interpreter associations to help advise on the process. So what are some of the things that the IMI did to get this process started? We started posting training programs on the website of the association so that individuals who wanted to work as medical interpreters were able to find it. Because let me explain something. In the United States, you can't work in a hospital as a medical interpreter without being trained. Even if you want to volunteer, you do need to have training. They're required to only allow individuals who are trained. Now, that doesn't mean that patients don't ever use family members and friends. It does occur, but they will not accept you as a volunteer or as an employee if you're not trained. So there is a need for training. So the IMI started approving trainings and started categorizing the training programs, and then decided what components would be utilized to accredit the programs, did a job analysis, and then developed a continuing education program for certified interpreters. And what I mean by that is that once you're certified in the United States to practice as a medical interpreter, you have to accumulate 30 hours of continuing education every 5 years in order to maintain your accreditation. So now there's a system to approve the continuing education workshops that are given around the country. So that was an important project that now allows individuals to accumulate continuing education units, much like many other professionals do, in order to maintain their licensure or accreditation. I'm going to focus, the reason that job analysis is actually bolded is because I'm going to focus on this a little bit, because that was the basis for a lot of the educational requirements that we are proposing to launch very soon this year. So this job analysis was done back in January of 2009, and basically it was done by an organization of psychometricians. Now, psychometricians are specialists in testing. And by being specialists in testing, basically what they do is they have a very rigorous process in order to develop the skills and the knowledge that are needed for any particular occupation. And it all starts with, obviously, a survey. Now, over 2,000 individuals responded to the survey, 88% completed the survey. It was a very, very long survey with an enormous number of tasks, and interpreters had to actually rate all those tasks. So before the survey was even created, there was review of many job descriptions, training curricula, inventory of the activities, knowledge and skills was created. There were meetings with expert panels, and then the job analysis was developed with 76 tasks and 88 knowledge areas. And for each particular task and knowledge area and skills area, there were questions asked about how often do you do this task? How important is this task for your work? And to what level do you need to be competent to be able to accomplish this task? And what is your command of this knowledge or skill? So for every single one, they had to answer based on their work as practicing medical interpreters. A national sampling plan was created, email lists were sent out, and it was stratified by state. This was a US survey, and also by types of medical setting. And I can't give you all the details of the study, but this just gives you a general idea of the main knowledge areas that seem to be important enough based on the survey to be not only taught but tested for anyone who wants to practice in medical interpreting. I'm not going to list them all. And these would be the skill areas. And when it says speaking in language in context, meaning in the medical context and understanding medicalese, as they say. So basically that job analysis really gave the knowledge and skills that we needed to be able to test interpreters. That was the basis for the certification exam, and it's also the basis for the training accreditation development standards. So the IMIA surveyed members of the association regarding what qualifications should instructors have. Now, as I said before, there are university programs that teach medical interpreting in the United States, but there are also private companies that teach medical interpreting. And there are really no, just as in the past there were no qualifiers for medical interpreters, there were really no qualifiers for medical interpreter instructors. If you were an interpreter, a lot of times you were called in to start training the next group of interpreters. So the survey was very helpful in giving the IMIA some feedback into what individuals practicing believe should be the qualifications of instructors. It decided it was going to accredit medical interpreting programs that teach on-site and online, and also that teach community interpreting and have a medical interpreting component within their community interpreting course. It was adapted by, we adapted the only accreditation program that we found for interpreters was for sign language interpreters. So the consortium of interpreter education for sign language interpreters already had a system, and we based the medical interpreting accreditation on that system. The standards have been edited extensively, and right now they're basically going public review. And if you go on the IMIA website, you could actually see all the standards, and if you are a practicing medical interpreter or practicing medical interpreter trainer, you would be able to respond to the survey. And right now there are pilot programs being held so that we can really see one with a college scenario and one with a private company scenario. Now this is the IMIA directory, and basically I would say 70% of all the training programs in the United States are listed here. There's some training programs that from abroad that are here, but the majority are in the US. And it's a database that can be searched by type of program, by language, by state, by country. And it's a very useful way for someone to find out what are the educational opportunities for me. And the interesting thing is that with online interpreter education, we're seeing individuals, interpreters from China, from Japan, from different countries actually taking online courses that are offered in the United States and getting certificates in medical interpreting, because their countries don't offer it. So they're doing it online so that they can get the specialized education that they want. Now, these are the different areas of the standards, but I'm only going to focus in two. I know I have only 30 minutes. I want to make sure that this would take me much longer. So to me, the most interesting ones are instructors and curriculum. And I'll go quickly over instructions because curriculum is a little bit longer. But this gives you a flavor of the standards for the educational programs. And some of these might actually seem quite obvious, you know. Employ instructors who have bachelor's degrees. You would think that they would actually be required to have more. But when you're considering companies training interpreters, we need to make sure that at least that would be the minimum qualification. Having a program director that actually has a knowledge and understanding of medical interpreting, IMI standards of practice, so that they can actually supervise the program. This 5C is a very interesting one. Because certification is now in place, there is now going to be a requirement that instructors be certified. And certification is quite new in the United States. It was launched in 2009. And until very recently, it was only in Spanish. Now there are 7 languages for which one can get certified in medical interpreting, and that will continue to grow. So now the expectation is if you teach interpreting in a university or a private setting, and if that instructor is an interpreter in one of the languages that could be certified, they have an obligation to get certified within a certain period of time. So the standards are really going to rise, not just for the interpreters themselves, but for those that teach them. And then teaching methods, obviously, instructor experience. In the very beginning, many individuals who were teaching medical interpreters, and this still happens in many countries, aren't medical interpreters themselves. Maybe they're conference interpreters, maybe they're translators, but eventually, as more and more medical interpreters become professionalized, they start entering the field of instruction. And ideally, if you're going to be in teach a practitioner how to practice, you ought to be a practitioner yourself. Now, the last 3 here under instructors are not, they're in green because they're not actually requirements, they're recommendations. So subject matter experts and practicum supervisors need to be qualified as well. Now, we differentiate between those coming in, for example, medical professionals coming in to teach medical terminology, or maybe a dentist comes in to talk about dental terminology. These are subject matter experts. They don't need to be interpreters. They need to know their expertise. And practicum supervisors might be coordinators of language programs that are supervising a practicum. Language coaches, again, not all programs have language coaches, so it's not a requirement. But if there is going to be a language coach, then that individual has to be qualified as well to act as a language coach. And then continuing professional development plans are also a recommendation. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the curriculum. And the curriculum, without trying to mandate what gets taught, just remember that these are just minimal basic requirements. So some might seem like very low requirements, but remember that, again, because there is such a demand for these professionals, the training programs are growing, and there are new training programs every day. The universities don't have the capacity or the infrastructure to handle all the students. So we need to make sure that we are able to accredit some of these smaller programs. So 40 hours is the minimal training that these interpreters need to have. Now, one could say that it's not enough. But there are interpreters who actually have 40 hours of training that are able to get certified. as medical interpreters. So that will just raise through the years so that eventually we can phase out the private company trainings and we can really gravitate towards university programs, because that's a big need in our country, and we see in other countries the same scenario happening, where you have two parallel types of educational programs for medical interpreters. Medical interpreting is a specialization. That's really important because what happens in many countries is that medical interpreters are a breed that comes out of the hospital systems and not out of the language professions. Typically, conference interpreters aren't aware of this demand for medical interpreters, but hospitals need them. So they start training people, they start testing people, and all of a sudden you have a lot of individuals who become medical interpreters who really are not connected to the language world. So we need to make that connection. Medical interpreting, just as court interpreting or legal interpreting or educational interpreting, are all specializations of the interpreting profession, regardless of how they got trained or how they got started. Cultural competence, I'm not going to go into details on that. A syllabi, assessment by and of students. It's very important that the students have a chance to assess the programs that they're in so that they can let instructors know what needs to be taught, what isn't taught enough, so that we can all improve. Interpreter roles. Now, some of these can be quite controversial, but in medical interpreting, there are situations where interpreters are addressing cultural differences, are having to clarify linguistic issues so that they can interpret appropriately, etc. And addressing safety and discrimination is a reality that most interpreters do face, especially the patient safety issues, because while we operate under our interpreter ethics, we're also in a context where medical ethics is involved. And patient safety supersedes a lot of times confidentiality, for example. So there's complex ethical issues that medical interpreters have to deal with. Interpreter ethics, professional standards of practice. A lot of people aren't even aware that these have existed for quite some time. Back in the 80s, standards of practice were created that are really quite up to date in the sense of the practicality. And many interpreters just aren't aware that, you know, we have standards of practice. They've been translated into many languages. If you're not familiar, we're very thankful to those here that have done it. And I want to actually call out Michal Schuster just for a lot of work that she's done to promote medical interpreting in Israel. So I don't know how familiar you are with her work, but she really is a huge advocate in this country. And, you know, I see the changes happening, and it's really encouraging. Message conversion, obviously, the interpreting itself, interpreting in different modes needs to be part of the curriculum. There are still many programs that don't teach sight translation enough, and it's a skill that is very, very needed in medical interpreting, because there are many consent forms and instructions that aren't translated that need to be sight translated on the spot. So it's an important and crucial skill for medical interpreters. Understanding the healthcare industry, it's really important that they know the medical system. And if they're not local, because they're immigrants themselves, they need to learn and understand that system. And it's not that easy. Many times nationals don't understand the system that well. Interpreting in difficult situations, that does happen. And interpreters that are starting, they need to really be able to know what types of situations they're going to face so that they don't panic when they face them. And medical interpreters many times are surprised when they go into the medical field and, you know, they have to see blood or they have to see something that's just not something that they were expecting. So not everybody has the ability to be in those type of situations. Medical terminology obviously is a minimal, and when we talk about 8 hours minimum, we're talking about in class, but obviously out of class, a lot more has to be given. Medical terminology research, compiling glossaries. Where do we find the terminology? Not everything's in the dictionary, and thank God for Google and the internet. I'm from the days when we had to open our dictionaries and call professionals to get the terminology. So we really need to teach that, because it's such a specialized field that without those skills, they're really not going to be able to do their work properly. Simultaneous, note-taking, and practicums are very important in medical interpreting. You can't teach everything in a classroom and then expect that individual to go into a hospital setting and feel comfortable in that setting. So the best way is for educational institutions really to partner with hospitals, and that's been done over and over. And the IMI helps in connecting hospitals and institutions so that their students can go to the hospitals and really get the practicum experience that they need before they are out there interpreting solo. And interpreting research. It's really important that we connect research to practice, and that interpreters see all the research that's been done and learn from that research, because without it, they're just practicing without all the theoretical background and all the support that they need. So it's really important that we connect that. So these are some of the very basic requirements that we're going to launch later this year. And any educational institution that offers medical interpreting courses will be able to apply for the accreditation process. I mean, I could go on and on about the auditing and site visit, but the ideal situation here is that this is going to promote the professionalization of medical interpreters. Because, as the speaker before me was saying, we do have a profession, translators and interpreters, that is in different stages. But in any profession, unless you have standardized educational expectations, until you have standardized testing in the form of some kind of certification, and until you have even licensing in some cases, you really don't have an organized profession. And membership in an association, I mean, it's shocking to hear that some countries have low adherence to professional associations. Some countries require it. You can't practice unless you're a member of that association. How do you know? How can you update yourself in what's happening in the field? So I urge everyone here, if you're not affiliated with the Israeli Translators Association, do that. Because I'm sure they're doing a lot of work trying to professionalize the field, creating initiatives to educate the public. But if you're not part of that, then what are you doing to support that system? We need society to really value our work, whatever it is, whether it's translation, interpreting, community interpreting, conference interpreting. We need everyone to understand the work we do, but we need to organize ourselves. So it's a call here for us to organize ourselves and to really work together towards standardizing systems so that we get away from that concept that any bilingual can interpret. Because when we're allowing individuals into the field that don't even know what it takes, then they're going out there and saying, well, I translate, but you don't really need to know anything other than just being bilingual. They're actually giving wrong information to society about the work, because that's their experience, but that's not necessarily a professional translator speaking. That's someone who entered the profession without the training or the educational background to really do that as a professional. So this gives you an idea of some of the things that are going on in the United States, and I hope we have time for questions at a later time. Thank you very much.